Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Chapter 7. The author, being informed of a design to accuse him of the highest treason, makes his escape to Blefuscu. His reception there. Before I proceed to give an account of my leaving this kingdom, it may be proper to inform the reader of a private intrigue which had been 2 months forming against me. I had been hitherto all my life a stranger to courts, for I was unqualified by the meaning of my condition. I had indeed heard and read enough of the dispositions of the great princes and ministers, but never expected to find such terrible effects of them in so remote a country, governed, as I thought, but very different maxims from those in Europe. When I was just preparing to pay my attendance on the Emperor of Blefuscu, the considerable person at court, to whom I had been very serviceable a time when he lay under the highest displeasure of his Imperial Majesty, came to my house very privately at night in a close chair, and without sending his name, desired admittance, and the chairmen were dismissed. I put a chair, with, with his lordship in it, into my coat pocket, and giving orders to a trusty servant to say I was indisposed and gone to sleep, I fastened the door of my house, placed the chair on the table, according to my usual custom, and sate down on it. After the common salutations were over, observing his lordship's countenance full of concern, and inquiring to the reason, he desired I would hear him with patience in a matter that highly concerned my honour and my life. His speech was the following effect, for I took notes of it as soon as he left. You are to know, he said, that several committees of the council have been lately called in the most private manner of your account, and it is but 2 days since his Majesty came to a full resolution. You are very sensible that Skyras Boglum or Galbit, or the High Admiral, has been your mortal enemy ever since your arrival. His original reasons I know not, but his hatred is much increased since your great success against Blefuscu, by which his glory as the admiral is obscured. This lord is conjunction with the Flimnap as the high treasurer, whose enmity against you is notorious on account of his lady. Limtock the general, Laukon the chamberlain, Balmuff the grand justiciary, have prepared articles of impeachment against you for treason and other capital crimes. This preface made me so impatient, being conscious of my own merits and innocence, that I was going to interrupt, when he entreated me to be silent, and thus proceeded. Out of gratitude for the favours you have done for me, I procure information of the whole proceedings in the copy of the articles, wherein I ventured my head for your service. Article 1. Whereas the statute of the made in reign of his Imperial Majesty, Callan Defarplune, is enacted, that whoever shall make water within the precincts of the royal palace shall be liable to the pains and penalties of high treason. Notwithstanding, the said Quinbus Flestrin, in the open breach of the said law, under the colour of extinguishing the fire kindled in the apartment of his Majesty's dear imperial consort, did maliciously, traitorously, and devilishly, by the discharge of his urine, put out the said fire kindled in the said apartment, lying and being within the precincts of the said royal palace, and against the statutes in that case provided against the duty. Article 2. That the said Quinbus Flestrin, having brought to the imperial fleets of the Blefuscu in the royal port, being afterward commanded by his Imperial Majesty to seize all ships of the said empire of Blefuscu, and reduce that the empire to a state of province, to be governed by a viceroy from hence, and to destroy and put to death, but not only from the big Indian exiles, but likewise all people of that empire, who would not immediately forsake the big Indian heresy. He, the said Flestrin, like a false traitor against his most auspicious, serene imperial majesty, did petition to excuse from the said service, upon pretence of unwilling to force the conscience or destroy the liberties and lives of innocent people. Article 3. That, whereas the certain ambassadors arrived from court from Blefuscu to sue peace for his majesty's court, he, it is said, Flestrin did, like a false traitor, aid, abet, comfort, and divert the said ambassadors, although he knew them to be servants of a prince who was lately an open enemy to his imperial majesty, in an open war against his said majesty. Article 4. That the said Quimbus Flestrin, contrary to the duty of a faithful subject, is now preparing to make a voyage to the court and empire of Blefuscu, for which he hath received only verbal license from his imperial majesty, and under the colour of the said license doth falsely and traitorously intend to take the said voyage, and to thereby aid, comfort, and abet the emperor of Blefuscu, so late an enemy in an open war with his imperial majesty aforesaid. There are some other articles, but these are the most important, of which I had read to you in abstract. In the several debates upon this impeachment, it must be confessed that his majesty gave many remarks of his great lenity, upon urging you the service that you have done for him, and endeavouring to extenuate your crimes. The treasurer and admiral insisted that you should be put to the painful and ignominious death by setting fire on your house at night. The general was to attend 20,000 men, armed with poisoned arrows, to shoot you on your face and hands. Some of your servants were to have private orders to strew poisonous juice on your shirts, which would soon tear your own flesh, and die in the utmost torture. The general came into the same opinion, for that for a long time there was a majority against you, but his majesty resolving, if possible, to spare your life, at last brought off the chamberlain. Upon this incident, registral principal secretary for all affairs was approved himself to be your true friend. They are commanded by the emperor to deliver his opinion, which he accordingly did, and therein justify the good thoughts you have for him. He allowed your crimes to be great, but that there still was room for mercy, and the commendable virtue in a prince, for which his majesty was so justly celebrated, said that the friendship between you and him was so well known to the world, that perhaps the most honourable board might think him partial. However, in the obedience to the command he had received, he would freely offer his sentiments, that if his majesty, in consideration of your services, in pursuant of his own merciful disposition, would please to spare your life, and only to give order to put out both your eyes, he humbly conceive, by this expedient the justice might some measure be satisfied, and all the world would applaud by the lenity of the emperor, as well as the fair and generous proceedings of those who had put honour to be his counsellors. And the loss of your eyes would be no impediment of your bodily strength, by which you might be still useful to his majesty. That blindness is an addition to courage, by concealing dangers from us. That the fear you had for your eyes, the greatest difficulty of bringing over the enemy's fleet. It would be sufficient for you to see by the eyes of the ministers, since the great princes would do no more. This proposal was received by the utmost disapprobation by the whole board. Beauclerc the admiral could not preserve his temper, but rising up in fury, he said he wondered how the secretary durst presume to give his opinion for preserving the life of a traitor; that the service you performed were, by all true reasons of state, in the great aggravation of your crimes; that you, who were able to extinguish the fire by the discharge of your urine in her majesty's apartment, which he mentioned with horror, might at another time raise indignation by the same means, to drown the whole palace, and the same strength which enabled you to bring over the enemy's fleet might serve on the first discontent to carry it back. That he had good reasons to think you are a big Indian in your heart, and that treason begins in the heart before it appears in overt acts. So he accuses you as a traitor on that account. Therefore insists you to be put to death. The treasurer was of the same opinion. He shewed to what streets his Majesty's revenue was to reduce by the charge of maintaining you, would, but which would soon grow insupportable. That the secretary's expedient of putting out your eyes was so far being remedied against all this evil. It would probably increase it, as it is manifest from the common practices of blinding some kind of fowl, which they afterward fed faster, and soon grow fat. That his sacred majesty and the council, or your judges, were in all own consciences of fully convinced to your guilt, which is a sufficient argument to condemn you to death, without the formal proofs required by the strict letter of law. But his majesty was fully determined against the capital punishment, which was graciously pleased to say, that since the council thought the loss of your eyes was too easy a censure, that some other may be inflicted thereafter. And your friend the secretary humbly desired to be heard again, in answer to what the treasurer had objected concerning the great charge of his majesty was of maintaining you, and said that his excellency, who provided a sole disposal of the emperor's revenue, might be easily provided against that evil, gradually lessening your establishment, by which, for want of sufficient food, you would grow weak and faint, lose your appetite, and consequently decay and consume for months. Neither would the stench of your caress be then so dangerous, when it should become more than half diminished, and immediately upon your death 5 or 6 thousand of his Majesty's subjects might, in 2 or 3 days, cut your flesh from your bone and take it away in cartloads, and bury it in distant parts to prevent infection, leaving the skeleton as a monument of admiration to posterity. Thus, by the great friendship of the secretary, by the whole affair was compromised. It was strictly enjoined that the project of starving you was by degrees kept a secret, but the sentence of putting out your eyes was entered on the books, none dissenting except Boglim the admiral, who, being a creature of the empress, was perpetually extenuated by her majesty to insist upon your death. She had borne perpetual malice against you, upon that infamous illegal method you took to extinguish the fire out of her apartment. In 3 days your friend the secretary will be directed to come to your house, read before you the articles of impeachment, then signify your great lenity in favour of his majesty, and the council, whereby you were only condemned to the loss of your eyes, which his majesty doth not question, you will gratefully and humbly submit to. And 20 of his majesty's surgeons will attend, in order to see the operation well performed, by discharging very sharply pointed arrows into the balls of your eyes, as you lie on the ground. Leave to your prudence what measures you will take, and to avoid suspicion, I must return in as privacy a manner as I came. His lordship did so, and I remained alone, under many doubts and perplexities of mind. It was a custom introduced by this prince and ministry, very different, as I have been assured, from the practices of former times, that after the court had decreed any cruel execution, either to gratify the monarch's resentment or the malice of a favourite, the emperor made a speech to the whole council expressing his great lenity and tenderness, qualities known and confessed by all the world. This speech was immediately published through the kingdom, nor did anything terrify the people as much as those encomiums of his majesty's mercy. And because it was observed that more of these phrases were enlarged and insisted on, and the more inhuman was the punishment, and the sufferer more innocent, And as to myself, I must confess that I've been never designed for a courtier of either my birth or education. I was so ill a judge of things that I could not discover the lenity in favour of this sentence, but conceiving it, perhaps erroneously, perhaps rather to my righteous than gentle, I sometimes thought of standing my trial, for I could although not deny the facts alleged of the several articles, yet I hoped that it would admit some extenuation, but having it in my life pursued many state trials, which I observed to terminate at the judges were thought to fit in direct. I durst not rely on so dangerous a decision, in so critical a juncture, and against such powerful enemies, which I was strongly bent upon resistance, for while I had liberty, the whole strength of the empire could hardly subdue me, that I easily might pelt the metropolis in pieces. But I soon rejected that project with horror, by remembering the oath I had made to the emperor, and the favours I had received for him, and the high title of Nardak he conferred upon me. Neither had I so soon learned the gratitude of courtiers to persuade myself that his Majesty's present in severities acquitted me with all the past obligations. At last I fixed upon a resolution, for which it was probable that I may incur some censure, and not unjustly, for I confess the O in preserving my eyes, and consequently my liberty, to my own great rashness and want of experience, because if I had then known the nature of princes and ministers, I would have since observed in many other courts, in their methods of treating criminals and less obnoxious than myself, I should with great alacrity in readiness of my submitted to so easy a punishment, but then hurried on by the precipitancy of youth, by having his Imperial Majesty's license to pay my attendance upon the Emperors of Blefuscu. I took this opportunity, before 3 days were elapsed, to send a letter to my friend the secretary, signifying my resolution of setting out that morning for Blefuscu, pursuant to leave I had got. Without waiting for an answer, I went to that side of the island where our fleet lay. I seized a large man of war, tied a cable to the prow, lifting up the anchors. I stripped myself in a cloth, together with my cloverlet, I brought under my arm into the vessel, and drawing it after me, and with wading and swimming, arrived at the royal port of Blefuscu, where people had long expected me. There landed 2 guides to direct me to the capital city, which is of the same name. I held them in my hands till I came within 200 yards of the gate, desired them to signify my arrival to one of the secretaries, and let him know I there waited his Majesty's command. I had an answer in about an hour, that his Majesty, attended by the royal family, and great officers of the court, were coming out to receive me. I advanced 100 yards. The Emperor and his trains alighted from their horses, and the Empresses and ladies from their coach. I did not perceive they were in any fright or concerned. I lay on the ground, took his Majesty's and Empress's hand, and told his Majesty that I was coming according to my promise, and with the license of the Emperor my master, to have the honour of seeing so mighty a monarch, to offer him any service in my power, in consistence of my duty with my own prince, not mentioning a word of my disgrace, because I had hitherto no regular information of it, and might suppose myself wholly ignorant of such a design. Neither I could reasonably conceive that the Emperor would soon discover the secret while I was out of his power, wherein, however, it would soon appear I was deceived. I shall not trouble the reader with any particular account of my reception at this court, which was suitable to the generosity of so great a prince, nor the difficulties I was in for the want of my house, in bed, being forced to lie on the ground, wrapped up in my coverlet.